We all know the formula for instilling healthy eating habits in our kids is so simple. And the overarching principle is, to avoid extremes. Like, for example, have your kids try everything, but don't force them to eat foods they don't like. That's number one. Also, pay attention to what your kids are eating, monitor it. But don't let your kids know that you're keeping an eye on it. Like, definitely don't let them think that you're obsessing over their food intake. That's a really bad one. Also, have healthy foods in the house. Try not to keep junk in the house. The reality is kids are going to eat whatever they can reach for. And if what's available to them are healthy options, they're going to develop a like for healthy foods. And if they're not used to eating a lot of junk food, it's probably not what they're going to reach for. And last, but definitely not least, is don't make food a reward or a punishment. That's probably the biggest one. So as long as you stay somewhere in the range of those principles, you're probably not going to be the cause of any kind of eating disorder or bad eating habits in your kids. So the big question is, then why do so many parents, with the best of intentions, cause or at least lead to eating disorders or just bad eating habits in their children? The answer is, it's because of their own unhealthy attitudes, they've had ingrained in them ever since they were kids. Take me, for example. I've been struggling with my weight my entire life. I've been on every diet in the book for decades. My weight has gone up and down, 60, 70 pounds at a time. Now, I think I finally found the answer, at least for me. About 4 or 5 months ago, I started on Wegovy, and it's been working really well. In fact, I did a video on it. If you want to watch it, it kind of goes through my journey. And in the video, I'll post a link to it here. So if you want to watch that, take a look. And in the video, I tell people that I'm going to report on my progress. So as of today, I've lost 30 pounds using Wegovy, and it's been relatively easy. So for me, that's worked. But that's not the point of today's video. Today, we're going to talk about our food issues that stem from things that happened in our childhood, the way our parents raised us, that could have potentially led to our eating disorders, and how we can prevent doing that with our kids. So for me, the truth is, my mom was a great mother in every respect. She really was, except when it came to food. I believe that because of factors and circumstances that happened when she was a child, they just led to some really messed up attitudes about food. And those were passed along to my brother, my sister, and me. And my dad, too. I think he grew up at the same time my mom did. And just, again, very similar factors that I think led to his sort of unhealthy attitudes, habits relative to food that impacted his children. So I've broken it down into 4 unhealthy food habits that led to my food issues that I believe were directly the result of the way my parents raised us or treated us relative to our eating habits. And maybe some of these will resonate with you folks out there, and maybe this will help identify those patterns in yourself so that you won't pass those along to your kids as well. So the number one I would call trigger for causing eating issues is unhealthy attitudes about eating schedules. And so that was having very regimented times of day when you were supposed to eat. And in our family, that was to the extreme. And again, there were factors that were unique to our family that I think really sort of highlighted that or escalated that. And that is, my dad was a printer. He worked nights. He worked the swing shift. So he had to be at work at 4 o'clock. So he would leave home probably around 3:30, 3:40. And my mom was adamant. She was committed to making sure that we had family dinner every day. So that meant we had to eat dinner probably around 3 o'clock. And even then it was kind of rushed, so my dad could get out the door to get to work. But the problem was, my brother, my sister, and I, we got home from school probably around 2:30 or so. And we had a big hot lunch at school, probably around 1:30, whatever. So when we got home, we were not hungry. The last thing we wanted was to have our big meal of the day, practically as soon as we got home. But that's what we had to do. So we ate, when we weren't hungry, and then that was kind of it for the day in terms of a meal. My mom had some food in the house we'd be able to pick at, like snack food. But that was the last meal of the day, at 3:30. And then around 8:30 or so, my mom would call us into the kitchen and we would have what she called treat. So treat it was basically like dessert. It consisted of like a little cake, like a ring ding or a yodel or a Suzy Q or a Twinkie, and then a candy bar. It was either a Snickers or a Milky Way or a Three Musketeers or an O. Henry or something. And then we get a glass of Coke. It was always soda. It was almost always Coke. And, my mother, back then, people weren't as attuned to nutrition. So I don't think I know she wasn't aware of the fact that, what you don't want to do is give your kids massive amounts of sugar and caffeine and then try to get them to bed. Because, by 8:30, 9 o'clock, when she tried to put us to bed, we were like bouncing off the walls every night, tearing the bedrooms apart, having slipper fights and moving beds and wrestling. And she would go crazy, go crazy with us. This would go on for sometimes hours until we heard the garage door open. We know my dad was home, and we had ran in bed, shut the lights off, pretended we were sleeping. And my mom was a co-conspirator because she was afraid my dad would get mad that, why aren't the kids sleeping? So that was the regular pattern. And then what was even worse in some ways was, as a special treat, every so often, like maybe every few weeks, my dad on a Friday night when he came home from work, which was like 1 a.m, he'd bring home pizza. So my mom would wake us up out of a dead sleep. Hey guys, Dad brought home pizza. So we'd stumble into the kitchen half asleep and stuff our faces and then go back to sleep. So it was like talking about a train wreck, eating disorder, looking for a place to happen. That was probably the worst thing they could have done. Another trigger, I would say trigger for just bad attitudes about food and causing eating disorders was, that they rewarded us for overeating. And I think this had to do with the fact that they were both born during the Depression, didn't have a lot of food. Food was scarce. And, back then, people were really afraid that their kids weren't going to have enough food to survive. And I think that was so ingrained in my mom and dad that they just encouraged us, the more we ate, the better. They kind of wanted us to make sure that we had some fat on us. So if we ever ran out of money and there wasn't food, we would survive. We wouldn't die. So how that would play out was, I remember, when we had, we all loved, hamburgers, cheeseburgers. My dad would grill. I remember saying to my dad, Dad, I ate five cheeseburgers. I ate five. He was like, oh, good job, good job. Same with pancakes. When we had pancakes, on whatever Saturday morning, it was like an eating contest where we'd eat 6, 7, 8 pancakes. See who could eat the most. And again, my particularly my dad kind of encouraged that. So real bad because now as an adult, it's like somewhere in my subconscious, I have this idea that eating a lot is good. The more you eat, the better. And rationally, I know that's not bad, but that's just such a ingrained habit in me. It's something I couldn't get rid of. So the third major trigger is forcing your kids to eat foods they don't like. Again, it's good to have kids try stuff, but don't make them eat foods that they don't like or are just repulsive to them. For us, again, it was amplified by 1,000 by the fact that, during the week, my mom didn't spend a lot of time and effort on cooking. We had a lot of convenience food. Some of them were kind of gross. But the worst was, part of the Greek culture, at least back then, was you don't eat meat on Wednesdays and Fridays. So Friday was fish night. And, it wasn't like back then, my parents knew about grilling a nice piece of swordfish or putting some nice salmon in the oven. We would get these fish from the fish market that were full fish, and they were very bony, oily, scaly fish, and like a bluefish or porgy, and they were inexpensive. My mom would plop a whole fish on your plate, and sometimes I think it had a tail and head, and you have to open it up, pull the bones out, and every piece you ate had little bones in it. In the skin, it was just disgusting. Wednesday night, was also meatless, but that was in some ways even worse than the fish. My mom would give us some of these Greek dishes, these vegetarian Greek dishes, and they were not really good, vegetarian dishes you get nowadays. these were like basic sort of country home cooking vegetarian meals that they had in Greece. One was every Greek kid's nightmare is this dish called spanakorizo. It's this mixture of rice, spinach, and tomato sauce, all kind of mushed together. It was disgusting, and we had to eat it. We had to finish it. The other biggie was, I remember she called them sardines, but they were anchovies. She'd open up a can of anchovies, put it in a bowl, serve, with a basket of like Wonder Bread that you pass around, and you're supposed to make like an anchovy sandwich. And it was, for kids, it's like the most fishy, just nasty, salty taste. And we had to like eat this sandwich on Wonder Bread. And my mom would go like, "Oh no, kids, it's delicious. Just put a little oil on it." But again, we were forced to eat that. Just really not good. And then I guess the last, eating disorder trigger was this idea that, and it kind of goes back to the Depression era mentality, is you don't waste food. You do not throw out food. If you don't like it, you eat it, and you won't get it the next time, okay. But you didn't throw food away. So again, it was like we were kind of forced to eat food because you just didn't get rid of stuff. That people are starving. In Ethiopia, you got to eat that. I remember my mom, when she was cleaning up the dishes, if there wasn't enough, food to have actual leftovers the next day, she would just eat the food that was left. Even though she didn't want, you could just tell. She almost looked like she was just repulsed by it, but she would just eat it. We used to call her the human garbage disposal. But that kind of mentality, was also kind of passed around to us. So, these bad food habits, were just so bad. And now in retrospect, we're almost predictable that they were going to cause, eating problems for my brother and my sister and me. So the real question then is, what do you do to prevent this sort of thing? What do you do about this so you don't pass these along to your kids? I think the solution is actually pretty simple, and that is, talk to your spouse and kind of figure out the game plan, the strategy when it comes to meals, meal planning, meal prep, and just your approach to instilling good eating habits in your kid. But do it, before the kids come or when they're really young. Don't, kind of figure it out as you go. Don't, kind of do it in the moment. Sort of almost like make a list of the principles that you're going to adhere to when it comes to your kids eating. And again, it's real simple stuff. Have your kids try everything, but don't force food on them. Keep a lot of healthy foods in the house. Don't buy a lot of junk, but also like don't make any foods like super taboo. Don't make food a reward. Don't make it a punishment. Making kids like not eat dinner if they've done something wrong or misbehaved, and also like don't micromanage their eating. Kind of don't obsess over it, but just kind of keep an eye on it. And the other thing is, I think it's good to sort of commit to making time for food, and that means, making time to buy good food, prep it, make good food, and actually, sit down and have meals. I do think that's important. And this was a biggie. And this one, was something I used with my family, which was I recognized that I had like really messed up attitudes about food. And as much as I really try to insist, I try to do the right thing relative to raising my kids. And I'm very opinionated with my wife and my kids about approaches to parenting. But with the food issue, I recognized like I didn't have a lot of good input on that. I kept my mouth shut a lot, and I deferred to my wife on that. And she had really good attitudes about food, and as a result, I think my kids have exceptionally just good eating habits. And I really owe that to my wife. But I very deliberately kind of just stepped out of that fight. It was like I kind of let her handle that. So anyway, that's it for today. If this was helpful to you, I would love it if you subscribed, hit the subscribe button, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So please do drop me a comment, and we'll see you next time.